Jack Turner's farm was his legacy, a sprawling, sun-drenched expanse of pasture and fields that had been in his family for generations. Nestled on the outskirts of Cedar Valley, the farm was more than just land. It was the heartbeat of his life. Every morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Jack would step outside his weathered farmhouse to tend to his livestock, check on his crops, and enjoy the simple pleasures of country living. Whether it was the scent of fresh hay in the barn or the soft lowing of cattle in the distance, every detail of the property was a reminder of the heritage and hard work that had built his world. A proud rancher and a devoted dog lover, Jack had spent years cultivating not only the land, but also a loyal pack of working dogs. These intelligent, energetic animals were more than pets. They were his trusted partners, helping him herd cattle, guard the property, and even provide companionship during long, quiet evenings. Jack's connection to his dogs was a symbol of his self-reliance and love for his rural way of life. However, the peaceful rhythm of life on the farm was about to be disrupted by an unwelcome force. Over the past few months, whispers of HOA overreach had reached even the quiet corners of Cedar Valley. At the center of this controversy was Kerren Miller, the self-appointed enforcer of community standards and the de facto leader of the local homeowners association. Always impeccably dressed in crisp skirts and polished shoes, Kerren carried a clipboard like a badge of honor. In her eyes, every property, no matter how unique or time-honored, must conform to her narrow, rigid vision of perfection. The first sign of trouble came on an unusually hot summer afternoon. Jack was inspecting a section of his newly planted field when he noticed a group of well-dressed individuals casually strolling through his property. At their head was Kerren, flanked by a few of her equally prim HOA friends. They walked along his dirt road, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they were trespassing on private land. Kerren's gaze swept over the rows of crops with an air of condescension, as if critiquing a public park rather than a working farm. "Jack, I'm here on behalf of the HOA," Kerren announced in a tone that brooked no argument. "We're conducting a community walkthrough, and I must remind you that your property should be maintained according to our guidelines. Your fields, left untended and overgrown, are an eyesore." Jack's weathered face hardened as he stepped forward. "Kerren, my farm is my home," he replied firmly. "I take pride in every furrow and every acre of this land. My fields might not look like a manicured lawn, but they're maintained in a way that works for me and my family. I didn't ask for an HOA inspection, and I certainly don't appreciate being told how to run my own property." A murmur of discontent rippled through the small crowd of onlookers, neighbors peeking from behind fences and barn doors. Kerren's eyes narrowed, and she produced a final warning notice from her clipboard. "The rules apply to everyone, Jack," she said coolly. "If you don't bring your property up to standard, further action will be taken." That brief, tense exchange set the stage for a brewing battle. Jack felt an icy anger as he watched Kerren and her entourage walk off, leaving him with the heavy realization that his autonomy was being challenged by a group determined to impose their vision of order, even on a decades-old family farm. As the afternoon sun dipped low over the fields, Jack sat on his porch with a steaming mug of coffee, vowing to defend his land and the legacy it represented at all costs. The seeds of conflict had been sown, and the first confrontation was only the beginning. The morning after the trespass, Jack awoke to find an official envelope taped to his farmhouse door. Its embossed seal and dense legal language made it clear the HOA was not taking this matter lightly. Jack carefully opened the envelope and discovered a fine of $750, along with a stern warning for failure to maintain community standards. The notice cited obscure regulations and hinted at further legal action if his property did not conform within 48 hours. Before Jack could process the shock, he stepped outside and found Kerren waiting near the entrance of his property. With arms crossed and a self-satisfied smirk, she greeted him. "Good morning, Jack. I trust you read the notice? The rules apply to everyone, and it's essential that your property meets our community standards." Jack's jaw clenched. "Kerren, my farm isn't a suburban playground. These are my crops, my animals, and my way of life. I'm not going to let arbitrary fines dictate how I run my own land." Kerren's tone remained icy as she replied, "It is my duty to enforce the HOA guidelines. If you refuse to comply, further actions, including inspections and additional fines, will be imposed." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jack seething. Later that day, as Jack inspected the perimeter of his property to assess any further damage, he noticed a nondescript van parked near his gate. Two inspectors, dressed in official uniforms and armed with clipboards, emerged and began measuring the boundaries of his fields. They took photographs, made notes, and occasionally conferred with each other in hushed tones. Jack's heart pounded. This was not a casual visit, but a concerted effort to document every perceived infraction on his property. Determined not to be intimidated, Jack activated his security system and began snapping photos and recording videos of the inspectors at work. His loyal dogs barked at the strangers, adding a layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. Every click of the camera shutter was a silent protest, a refusal to let his home be treated like a public exhibit for bureaucratic enforcement. That evening, in the dim light of his office inside the barn, Jack compiled all the evidence. He carefully assembled a dossier of photographs, video clips, and detailed notes that documented the entire intrusion. With meticulous care, he drafted a formal complaint to the local zoning office, citing long-established agricultural exemptions and property rights that protected him from such arbitrary interference. His complaint was both a legal challenge and a declaration of independence, a statement that he would not allow the HOA to trample on his legacy. Word of the incident spread quickly through Cedar Valley. At the local feed store and in quiet conversations at community gatherings, other property owners began sharing their own experiences of HOA overreach. Even those who had long accepted Kerren's draconian rules were starting to question the fairness of her actions. The community was awakening, and Jack's resolve only grew stronger. As dusk fell and the cicadas began their nightly chorus, Kerren returned to the ranch. Under the glow of a single porch light, she delivered an ultimatum. "Jack, you have 48 hours to restore your property to acceptable standards, or face additional fines and enforcement measures." Her voice was cold, unyielding, and imbued with the authority she assumed. Jack's reply was quiet but resolute. "I'll maintain my land as my family has for generations. I won't let you or your arbitrary rules dictate my way of life." With that, he closed the door behind him, knowing that the battle for his farm's soul had only just begun. In the days following Kerren's ultimatum, the conflict at Jack's ranch escalated from isolated fines to a full-blown campaign of intimidation. What began as a single act of trespassing was now part of a larger pattern of abuse by the HOA. Neighbors started to whisper about how Kerren and her cronies were routinely roaming private properties under the guise of community inspections, and rumors began to circulate that fines were being used to line the pockets of a select few. One overcast afternoon, while Jack was mending a section of his fence, his longtime friend and neighboring rancher, Sam, pulled up beside him. "Jack, you're not the only one being harassed," Sam confided in a low voice. "I've heard that Kerren lets her HOA friends walk through our properties as if they own them, and fines us for it. People are fed up, and there's talk of a secret fund that she's been using for her personal expenses." Sam's words struck a chord. Jack's frustration over the water fine had grown into a broader concern over a systematic abuse of power. Determined to expose the corruption, he began a covert investigation. He made discreet trips to the county clerk's office to review HOA records, attended board meetings incognito, and even recorded whispered conversations between frustrated neighbors. Every piece of evidence he gathered painted a damning picture. Kerren was not enforcing community standards out of concern for the neighborhood. She was using her position to exert control and extract money. Late one rainy night, as thunder rumbled over Cedar Valley, Jack sat in the barn office, poring over photocopies of financial ledgers and anonymous notes. He compiled a detailed dossier that revealed irregularities in the HOA's finances, mysterious deductions from fines, unexplained transfers, and signs of forged documents. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Kerren's tactics were designed to subjugate property owners and enrich herself and her inner circle. Word of Jack's investigation began to spread. At a secret meeting held in the back room of a local feed store, several outraged homeowners recounted their own experiences with the HOA's invasive practices. An elderly woman tearfully explained how a minor infraction, a crooked mailbox, had resulted in a crippling fine, while another man admitted that he had been pressured into paying voluntary contributions that never reached any community improvement fund. The collective outrage was palpable, and Jack's determination only intensified. Realizing that the situation was spiraling, Jack upgraded his security system by installing additional cameras around the perimeter of his ranch. His loyal dogs, always alert and protective, played an important role in warning him of any unauthorized visitors. Every intrusion, every unannounced inspection, was captured in high definition. His phone and notebook became indispensable tools, recording every detail that might later be used as evidence. Meanwhile, Kerren's tactics became increasingly aggressive. In a series of curt, official letters, she threatened that any further noncompliance would result in severe penalties, including the possibility of legal action to seize portions of privately owned land deemed nonconforming. The community grew tense under these threats, and Jack knew that his fight was not just for his own property, but for the fundamental right of every homeowner to live free of arbitrary interference. One stormy night, as rain lashed against the barn and lightning illuminated the dark skies, Jack reviewed his dossier one final time. The evidence was irrefutable, and he resolved that it was time to take his case public. With determination burning in his eyes, he reached out to local journalists, handing over copies of the financial records, photos of invasive inspections, and recordings that detailed the HOA's abuses. Standing outside his ranch as the storm subsided, Jack gazed out over the land that had been so ruthlessly violated. He vowed then that he would not allow Kerren's corrupt system to continue unchecked. This battle was about much more than fines. It was about preserving the legacy of his ranch and the right of every property owner to live without fear of arbitrary intrusion. The tension reached its boiling point one sweltering morning when Jack arrived at his ranch to witness an act of blatant trespassing that would change everything. His once pristine pasture, where his cattle grazed and his crops thrived, had become a makeshift pathway for Kerren and her entourage of HOA friends. Without any permission, they were strolling through the middle of his property as if it were a public park, laughing, chatting, and taking selfies against the backdrop of his hardworking fields. Furious at this brazen display of entitlement, Jack knew he had to act decisively. He'd had enough of Kerren's constant intrusions and the arbitrary fines that followed. Drawing upon the loyalty and protective instincts of his well-trained dogs, beloved companions who had guarded his property for years, Jack devised a plan that would force a clear message into the hearts of his oppressors. Within a few hours, after securing his home and gathering his evidence, Jack released his dogs into the field. The dogs, a pack of energetic and vigilant herders, surged forward with a purpose. Their barking echoed across the open land as they intercepted Kerren and her companions in the middle of the trespass. Caught completely off guard, the group scattered in a mix of shock and disarray. Kerren, the orchestrator of this unwelcome parade, let out a startled cry as one of Jack's dogs playfully but firmly intercepted her path. The entire incident was captured on the security cameras Jack had so meticulously installed. The footage showed Kerren's bewildered expression and her frantic attempts to escape the bounding pack. The dogs, far from being aggressive in nature, were merely asserting their territorial rights, and their enthusiasm was enough to send a clear, unambiguous message. Jack's property was not a public thoroughfare. That afternoon, at the next HOA meeting held in the local community center, Jack took the stage with a file of irrefutable evidence in hand. With calm but unwavering resolve, he began to recount the events of the morning. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "what you witnessed on my property was not a casual stroll. It was an act of trespassing by Kerren and her HOA friends. My dogs, loyal and protective, were simply doing what they do best, defending our home." He then played the security footage on a large screen. The room fell silent as the video revealed the undeniable proof of the intrusion and the swift, effective response from his dogs. The crowd reacted with a mix of laughter and applause. Neighbors, who had long endured Kerren's overreach, were visibly moved by Jack's bold act of resistance. Some board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the evidence piled up, while others nodded in agreement, acknowledging for the first time that the HOA's enforcement was nothing more than a thinly veiled abuse of power. Kerren, however, refused to back down. At the back of the room, she glowered, her face flushing with indignation. "This is all circumstantial," she attempted to argue, but her words were drowned out by the overwhelming support for Jack's stance. "My property is my legacy," Jack continued, his voice resonating with passion. "I will not allow anyone, even someone who claims to represent the community, to trample on my rights. Today I've not only defended my land, but sent a message to every homeowner in Cedar Valley. Your property is yours alone." As the meeting drew to a close, the atmosphere was charged with determination and unity. The incident with the dogs had sparked something in the community, a collective realization that they could no longer tolerate the HOA's arbitrary rules and intrusive behavior. Jack's actions had transformed a personal grievance into a rallying cry for freedom. That evening, as Jack walked through his fields, he felt a surge of hope. His ranch, scarred by continuous attacks, now stood as a symbol of resilience. The dogs trotted happily at his side, a living testament to the power of loyalty and the importance of standing up for one's rights. Jack knew that Kerren's next move was coming, but he was ready. With the support of a community awakened to injustice and a pack of determined guardians by his side, the battle for his property had taken a definitive turn in his favor. Kerren, reeling from the public humiliation of being chased off by Jack's dogs, refused to accept defeat. In a last-ditch effort to regain control and intimidate Jack into submission, she resolved to take one final, desperate step. Late one evening, under the cloak of darkness, Kerren gathered a small group of loyal HOA enforcers and, accompanied by a couple of local security officers, returned to Jack's ranch with an ominous mission. Their objective was clear: to forcibly patrol the property, disrupt any further activity, and reassert the HOA's overreaching authority. As they crept toward the boundary under dim security lights, they believed that their numbers and authority would scare Jack into compliance. However, what they hadn't counted on was Jack's steadfast preparedness and his ever-vigilant security system. Hidden cameras along the perimeter captured every moment. The footage showed Kerren leading her group in a stealthy march across a section of the property, whispering orders and checking her clipboard with a determined glint in her eyes. Suddenly, as they advanced toward the core of the ranch, one of the motion sensors triggered an alarm. The loud, piercing sound shattered the silence of the night, and chaos ensued. In the ensuing confusion, Jack's dogs sprang into action once more. Their barks rang out like a battle cry as they intercepted the intruders. Caught in the glare of flashing security lights, Kerren and her enforcers scrambled to regroup. Amid the pandemonium, one security camera zoomed in on Kerren's face, a look of sheer terror and disbelief as she found herself cornered by the very defenders she had tried to intimidate. Her anguished screams filled the night air, a desperate plea that was captured in stark, unfiltered detail. The next day, at a specially convened HOA meeting held in the town hall, Jack stood before a packed crowd of homeowners and board members. With the damning footage projected on a large screen, he recounted the night's events with calm determination. "This," he said, gesturing toward the video, "is proof that Kerren is willing to use intimidation and even break the law to maintain her control. Her actions are not those of a community guardian. They are those of a bully, desperate, and unaccountable." Kerren's face, red and trembling on the screen, sparked a wave of outrage in the room. Murmurs and gasps filled the air as board members exchanged uneasy glances. In a futile attempt to salvage her position, Kerren tried to dismiss the incident as a misunderstanding and claimed that the alarm was triggered by an accidental misstep. But Jack's evidence was overwhelming, and her protests were drowned out by the collective voice of a community that had had enough. In a final desperate bid to reassert her authority, Kerren threatened to call in the police again, accusing Jack of harassing her and obstructing community activities. But the video evidence, combined with the testimonies of several witnesses, left no room for her claims. The community's support for Jack had reached a fever pitch, and it was clear that Kerren's days of unchecked tyranny were numbered. By the end of the meeting, as the crowd dispersed with a palpable sense of triumph, Jack's message was clear. His farm was his domain, and no one would be allowed to trample on his rights. Kerren's final, desperate move had backfired spectacularly, further cementing her reputation as a rogue enforcer rather than a community leader. That night, as Jack reviewed the footage one last time on his tablet, he felt a mix of sorrow for the damage inflicted on his ranch and satisfaction that justice was within reach. He knew that this evidence would be the cornerstone of any further legal action, and he resolved to pursue every available avenue to hold Kerren accountable for her reckless behavior. The fallout from Kerren's final, desperate act sent shockwaves through Cedar Valley. What had begun as isolated acts of intimidation had now snowballed into a full-blown rebellion against an overreaching HOA. Neighbors, emboldened by Jack's courageous resistance and the damning evidence against Kerren, began to rally together. Public meetings, protests, and town hall sessions became commonplace as residents demanded accountability and an end to the arbitrary abuses of power. At a particularly charged meeting held in the local community center, long-suffering homeowners took the floor to recount years of unjust fines, intrusive inspections, and personal hardships inflicted by the HOA's tyrannical rule. Testimonies poured in, stories of burned crops, vandalized property, and the constant fear of being overruled by an unaccountable enforcer. The room vibrated with a collective resolve that could no longer be ignored. Under mounting pressure and widespread public outcry, the HOA board found itself isolated. In a historic vote that was broadcast live, the board members, many of whom had grown disillusioned with Kerren's aggressive methods, unanimously voted to remove her from her position as HOA president. The decision was met with thunderous applause, tears of relief, and an outpouring of support from every corner of the community. For the first time in years, residents felt that their voices had been heard and that the oppressive regime was finally crumbling. Simultaneously, local authorities launched a thorough investigation into the HOA's practices. Auditors and legal experts uncovered a tangled web of misappropriated funds, forged documents, and systematic abuses that had exploited homeowners for far too long. Headlines in the local newspapers declared HOA tyranny toppled and community triumph over corruption, and the public reveled in the hope of a new beginning. For Jack, the removal of Kerren was both a personal and symbolic victory. His courageous stand, marked by the dramatic release of his dogs, had sparked a movement that not only reclaimed his property, but also set a precedent for every homeowner in Cedar Valley. As he sat on his porch each evening, watching the sunset over fields that were slowly healing from months of strife, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His ranch, scarred but unbowed by the conflict, now stood as a testament to the power of unity and the triumph of justice over tyranny. In the weeks that followed, the community restructured the HOA under new, democratically elected leadership. Neighbors began to work together to rebuild trust and restore their cherished properties. The once oppressive rules were replaced with fair, transparent guidelines that respected individual rights and local traditions. The spirit of community had been rekindled, and the legacy of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections was being replaced by genuine collaboration and respect. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across Maple Hollow, Jack took a quiet moment to reflect on the hard-won victory. The electrifying events, from the release of his protective dogs to the damning footage of Kerren's misdeeds, had united a community long divided by fear. Now, hope and determination shone in every corner, and the future looked bright for everyone who had dared to stand up for their rights. With the community united and the corrupt practices of the old HOA exposed, legal authorities moved swiftly to dismantle the system. Bolstered by Jack's comprehensive dossier, which included high-definition video footage, photographs, and detailed logs of every violation, the county launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's operations. The inquiry revealed a labyrinth of financial misappropriations, forged documents, and systematic abuses that had enriched a few at the expense of many. A series of class action lawsuits was filed on behalf of the affected homeowners. In a landmark courtroom session, a judge pored over pages of indisputable evidence and delivered a verdict that sent shockwaves through Cedar Valley. The HOA was to be dissolved immediately, its assets frozen pending further legal action, and its leadership held accountable for their crimes. The state attorney general even established an independent task force to oversee the restructuring of neighborhood associations, ensuring that such tyranny would never take root again. Local media exploded with the story. Headlines blared HOA tyranny dismantled and community triumph over corruption, and televised reports captured the jubilant reactions of residents who had long suffered under arbitrary fines and invasive inspections. Jack's pivotal lawsuit and his innovative countermeasures had become the rallying cry for property owners across the region. The legal verdict was a resounding affirmation that no one was above the law, and that collective action could dismantle even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Former board members faced intense scrutiny, and several were indicted on charges related to fraud and extortion. The dissolution of the old HOA marked the end of an era, a period defined by fear and bureaucracy, and the beginning of a new chapter in community governance built on transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights. As the legal proceedings against the HOA reached their conclusion, Kerren Miller's personal world began to crumble. Once the unyielding enforcer of arbitrary rules, she was now exposed as a tyrant who had abused her power for personal gain. Public scrutiny mounted as evidence of her misdeeds, especially her role in allowing her HOA friends to trespass on private property and her involvement in the burning of crops, was laid bare before the community. Her bank accounts were frozen, and assets that had once signified her authority were seized to cover fines and legal fees. In a dramatic and highly publicized vote, the HOA board forced her resignation. The media descended on her personal life, and gossip spread like wildfire. Neighbors whispered about her ruined reputation and the irony of her fall from grace. In a final bitter twist, Kerren was forced to accept a low-level position as an assistant property manager for another HOA, a body that prided itself on strict adherence to rules, the very rules she had once enforced with ruthless abandon. One brisk morning, as Jack drove past a modest office building where Kerren now worked in plain, unassuming attire, he couldn't help but smile and murmur under his breath, "I hope you like following the rules." That remark, laced with quiet satisfaction, quickly became the talk of the town, a potent symbol of poetic justice. Interviews with former board members and once intimidated residents painted a unanimous picture. Kerren's era of tyranny was over. Her personal collapse was not only a legal defeat, but a public spectacle, a cautionary tale of unchecked power and arrogance. The community, now liberated from her oppressive rule, celebrated her downfall as a victory for individual rights and local autonomy. For Jack, witnessing Kerren's personal ruin was deeply vindicating. His farm, scarred by months of conflict yet still thriving, stood as a testament to the resilience of those who refused to be cowed by bureaucracy. Every act of defiance, from releasing his loyal dogs to capturing her misdeeds on camera, had paved the way for this moment of justice. Kerren's downfall was complete, and her legacy was now a reminder of what happens when power is abused. In the months that followed the dissolution of the corrupt HOA and Kerren's public downfall, Cedar Valley began to experience a renaissance of community spirit. The oppressive shadow of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections faded away, replaced by a renewed sense of unity and empowerment. Jack's Ranch, with its restored dignity and fields that now thrived under careful stewardship, stood as a beacon of resilience and independence. At a celebratory community picnic held on a crisp autumn afternoon, neighbors gathered to commemorate the dawn of a new era, one defined by fairness, transparency, and mutual respect. Laughter and music filled the air as families shared hearty meals, and children played freely among the fields. In a light-hearted moment, a local artist unveiled a satirical mural depicting a red-faced Kerren leading a parade of HOA enforcers, complete with speech bubbles reading "Follow the rules." A final, irreverent mic drop on her reign of terror. Seated on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, Jack watched the festivities with quiet satisfaction. The painful memories of past intrusions and burned crops had given way to hope and the enduring spirit of the community. When a longtime friend approached him with a mock HOA violation notice for excessive trespassing on private property, Jack simply grinned and replied, "They really tried." In that serene moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed Cedar Valley in golden hues, the legacy of oppression faded into memory. The community had reclaimed its rights, and the story of one man's steadfast defense of his land had become a powerful reminder that true power lies not in enforcing conformity, but in protecting one's heritage and freedom. Fade to black.